George. I'm just now going to share my screen, and oh, this is when you absolutely hate why it was there earlier on, wasn't it? Right, let me go to share my screen. Finally, yes, desktop. Right. You have to let me know if this is okay, George, because my computer's just, right, okay. Right, slideshow from start. This is, oh, am I okay, George? Super. Right, well, thank you very much, George, for a lovely introduction. Today I'm going to be talking about the graffiti, the historical graffiti in Winchester Cathedral, slightly out of my research until a few years ago, when, in collaboration with the Education Centre at the Cathedral, we started to do a survey of all of the graffiti in the cathedral with students under what's called the RAP scheme, which is the Winchester Research Apprenticeship Programme. So I've had several years of students going into the cathedral to photograph this survey for me, and so this is very much a work in progress, as we've got lots and lots of photographs. We're trying to make them in a database, and throughout this talk you'll see where there's areas for further research. So it's a snapshot of where we are now. So we're going to start with dear old Harry Copper. And we'll be coming back to him throughout the talk, because his wonderful piece of graffiti from 1545 really sets the scene for what I'm going to talk about. It is actually the earliest datable piece of graffiti in the cathedral. I cannot and have not yet found anything that can be reliably dated to the medieval period, and this is the earliest one. But he actually encapsulates a lot of the issues in terms of graffiti. So I'll start off by actually talking about the fact that the graffiti in the cathedral is all unofficial. This is not sanctioned by any authority within the cathedral, and we need to therefore consider its impetus and how and why people created it. And so, looking at now thousands of photographs that we do have, there are some themes that come into this. You may be bored, especially in earlier periods. There were quite a lot of long sermons, and you may well have been bored. But I think what is most significant is the fact that people are bringing themselves or their family or their friends into the cathedral for recognition that they could not otherwise have, because burial and commemoration within the cathedral was limited to a very small number of people. And therefore, if you are not part of the elite that are allowed that, how else can you bring yourself into this building? And that's one way of looking at graffiti, and that applies to all churches, not just cathedrals. It's parish churches as well. It's also important to understand that a commemoration is not often, if you're commemorating, say, James Middleton, it's not James Middleton, and we will see his graffiti in a moment, who actually created it. You are often seeing someone who has, we think, created something to bring somebody into the cathedral for memorialization or to commemorate them. It's not necessarily the person creating the graffiti to themselves. It all can also show us how the cathedral was actually viewed by people who are non-elite, that the cathedral was important enough to actually bring them in. Some of them are just pretty. There's one or two that you'll see that are very pretty. But one thing to always consider when looking at any graffiti is the opportunity that somebody had for creating it. Some of these are very large, some are very deep, some have obviously created a lot of noise when they were being made, yet the opportunity was there. And Harry, look at Harry's one, it's a very large piece of graffiti, and therefore you need to consider the fact that he had the opportunity in which to do it. Another factor that is really significant in terms of graffiti is the building sequence. And this applies to the cathedral, it applies to any church. When was it created and where? And what had happened to the building? before it. In the case of Winchester, this was a monastic community. It was the Priory of St Swithin until 1540, and then it was refounded as a secular cathedral. There is no evidence of any graffiti in the monastic period. And that may well be significant because the monks had a daily routine of prayers. They processed within the cathedral. The cathedral precinct was walled, access to it was limited, and therefore the fact that there is none that can be identified as medieval may well be because of the monastic cathedral that was there. The building has also had very little work done to it after the 16th century, and we need to consider that. The graffiti is being done on much older buildings. There is very little graffiti in the transepts. That is part of the original 1079 building, the Norman building, and therefore may reflect a different type of stone. So we'll be having a look at different areas of the cathedral and looking at how the graffiti is. I have not included any photographs of the crypt. The crypt of Winchester Cathedral regularly floods. If any of you have ever seen the Anthony Gormley statue, which is in the crypt reflected in the floodwater there, it's absolutely beautiful. And there is graffiti there, but mainly pencil marks, so I'm not going to include that. And we will look into the modern period as well. So the building sequence is really, really crucial. And as you can see from this, there is actually very little of the cathedral that was added after the 16th century. In fact, it's really only the maintenance and buildings to the northeast. And therefore, all we have is renovations to this. The building was complete by the 16th century. And so we need to look at that. What it means is that any graffiti from the 16th century is likely to survive because the building was not rebuilt. So we're going to start back with Harry. Now Harry puts this piece of graffiti when he becomes a bell ringer in 1545. That date is very significant. 1545 is 5 years after the dissolution of the monastic house, and the large visible piece of graffiti next to the pulpit of by the choir shows them he actually had the audacity to do it, and he did not expect any comeback by actually putting this large piece of graffiti in this really visible area. And it talks to us about the change of authority within the building. And that's really significant because from really the Reformation until about 1800, there was a gradual period of neglect in these major churches. And the graffiti needs to be seen within that period of neglect and the lack of authority perhaps within the building. He was able to do it, and you have to ask why. The other factor about where it is the fact he was a bell ringer. Why did he graffiti in this area? And that's because, by understanding the building sequence, and I really have to thank the guides of the cathedral here for their help with this, is that in 1545, he graffitied where the bell ropes came out of the bell tower, and that's where he pulled his bell. There is now, the red square illustrates the current bell ringer's chamber, but that was an 18th century building. Until that point, the bells were rung right back down where Harry did his graffiti. So you can actually tie in the graffiti with the changes of the building sequence in this period. So it can illustrate and add to our knowledge of the cathedral. What is significant, though, as well as where graffiti occurs, is to actually consider where graffiti does not occur. And while Harry's is in the presbytery right by the pulpit, there is actually, by the high altar and the great screen of about 1476, there is no graffiti. We cannot find anything in this area around the high altar. Now, was that because it was sacred and they didn't do it? Or was it the fact that this is where you would find clergy and therefore there was no opportunity? But gaps in graffiti are just as significant as where a graffiti occurs. In the presbytery, there is some around where Harry did his, and on the southern side as well. But once you get closer to the high altar, there is none at all. Now, below Harry's, there is other graffiti. Thomas Markham's is in a house structure. We find quite a lot of those in the cathedral. And we get the Bath, I'm assuming they're brothers, and they do occur elsewhere in the church. So this may well be bell ringers as well, because this is the area in which the bell ropes occurred. Please look at George Bath's, the E's on his, because it shows you how a lot of the graffiti, especially in the 17th century, was done, in that they would create dots and then score between them to create the letter. And we can see that because we do have examples in the cathedral of half-done letters, but it shows you the amount of time that they took to do it. So let's have a quick tour around the cathedral and have a look. The choir, which is wood, has a lot of graffiti. On the left-hand side is an example of where the choir boys sit. Now, the choir boys seem to have a bit of tradition here of adding their names into the choir stalls, and as you can see, there's a lot of names in here. I mean, T. Silver from 1790. What's interesting is the stalls behind for the adult choir do not have any graffiti in them really at all. So it's only the choir boys that did this. The picture on the right is the only Latin inscription we've found so far. It says Festum Pentecostes, and is actually outside and in the public area of the church. Not sure why they chose to celebrate the Pentecost, but they obviously did. So taking a tour around the cathedral, we'll start off with the ambulatory, the walkway around the east end. Now, these have large bays in which there are large flat sections of stone and therefore have been easily graffitied, and there is a considerable amount in this area. I've picked out here, and please forgive the photograph, some of the graffiti is actually very difficult to see, and this is one example from 1799, and it's a very tiny street scene. There's a three-dimensional house with flags and a flagpole, and it's an example of some of the ingenuity around the cathedral. But you ask yourself why he did it. Was he bringing his home and his family perhaps into the protection of the cathedral? Not sure. And in the next bay along to this is this one, quite large, quite deep, 1807. And I come from a village in which the village butchers have always been traditionally Hannams, so I found this very interesting. But this is in full view, an open space, and yet it is a complicated and detailed piece of graffiti. Was T. Hannam another butcher? Hence the knife, we'll never know perhaps. I am in danger now of showing you pretty pictures, which is a great failing of people who collect graffiti, but I'm hoping that you can actually see the range that the cathedral has. What we also have again in the ambulatory on the north side is this outline of a church dated to 1651. Somebody from at a conference did suggest that this was an outline of the cathedral. I'm actually not sure. I think it may well be someone bringing their own parish church into the cathedral themselves. Again, the interpretation of graffiti is really quite difficult. And that also applies to this one, directly opposite the garden of Chantry, and is the only example we have of a Charles, obviously in Latin. And Winchester Cathedral was attacked and infiltrated 3 or 4 times in the Civil War by parliamentary soldiers. Winchester was a royalist city. And in 1649, if you wanted to commemorate the death of Charles I, and at that point you didn't know he was the first, this might be a way of commemorating him in an era in which you weren't allowed to do this publicly. Great speculation, which is very naughty as a historian, but you have to wonder why. The R is nothing to do with it. This is the cross and the Carolus, but it is a suggestion that there is some kind of commemoration. Now, around the cathedral, most of the graffiti is initials, names. There's a few kind of tent houses. We do not have many figures of people. So we have here a sideways on face, perhaps graffitied later. Some graffiti overlays each other. We're not sure, but it's one of the few depictions we have of the human form. Now, my apologies for this photograph. It's very difficult to photograph this. But this is in the south transept. And the transept, as you can see from this, has very different stone, which may account for the lack of graffiti in this area. And this is not particularly easy to read, but it actually says William Eames is a papist, liar and flatterer. And one of the ongoing projects that I will have with my students from this is actually to start researching who William Eames was, and to actually add to our knowledge of the cathedral and community and the community of Winchester, to actually find out why somebody thought William Eames was so bad that he needed an insult in stone. This is quite old. It's now partially covered by a memorial board for the benefactors of the new Kings and Scribes exhibition, but luckily it's see-through. So we have here this insult in stone, which is rather fun. If we think about the south nave, there is an area of the south nave where there is very, very little graffiti. And that is due to the fact that in the early 19th century, the night door for the monks was taken out from here. And the area that replaced it of stone, there's very little graffiti on it, which might suggest that as time goes on, there is less graffiti, and might reflect this period of relative neglect, which allowed more graffiti to go on. But in the south nave, and in the south ambulatory, what we do have is a large number of military memorials. And these are quite significant in that the only place we have these rudimentary Union flags is attached to these military memorials. And these military memorials also have pencil and pen signatures around them, and they may well have attracted the graffiti of people who had an attachment to that part of the army. Again, this is an area that we can look at further on, but the Union flags I find quite significant here. And also in the south nave, we have Thomas Bath. Here he is again, and he's this time given us his date of 1603, along with George King. And what we also have in the south nave, and it's the only place it occurs, are the concentric circles on the right, probably created with a square and compass, along with the several circles created with a square and compass in a bunch. We actually do have a bunch of grapes, complete with leaves, in the north ambulatory. And we do have some of the concentric circles with sun rays coming out of them as well. But they tend to be concentrated in the south nave aisle. There's none around the windows, and there's very few daisy wheels, really, relatively speaking, in the cathedral. We'll have a look at some in a moment. But it gives you an idea really of what we've got in the south nave. And we also have this by William Wallace, an absolutely beautiful rendition. And my suggestion is that this is actually a depiction of the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul or Constantinople, as it's the only church I know that has got 5 spires in this style. And this suggests that either William had been there or was aware of the the stylization of this church, which by the post 1540 era was actually a mosque. And it does suggest why it is there, but it's the only depiction I've ever seen of a church of this nature. Rather beautiful, really. But again, it took him so long to do. It's such a lot of detail. And then we have this odd little, I call it a Dalek actually at the beginning. And this is located at the, in a pillar where if you sat in the centre of the nave towards the south, it is at elbow height. And so it's easily something you could sit and chisel away while you're listening to a very long sermon or in a long service. And you have to wonder what it is that he's actually doing. But if you look, if you sit in that same space with that piece of graffiti on your right elbow, what you're looking at is actually a depiction of the aisle of the church going towards the east end, along with the arcades of either side of the nave and the vaulting of the cathedral. And actually, I think this is someone who's graffitied what they see. And it's not a Dalek, it's far too old anyway, but it tells you what they're doing. And this may well represent boredom rather than anything else. Now, the north nave is really interesting. There is a lot more graffiti in the north nave on the pillars and in the bays. And we've actually sat and thought about why this may be. Well, the north nave is darker than the south. And it, therefore, maybe you had more opportunity to do your graffitiing here without being seen. And I quite like practical explanations like that, because there's no graffiti below knee level. Nobody ever laid on the floor to do their graffiti. They all did it from standing or sitting. And there's very little above head height. So what you have here is the practical thing that this is darker. In this period of relative neglect, you could actually hide here and do your graffitiing. And on some pillars, there is an enormous amount, well, most pillars actually, there's an enormous amount of graffiti. Some of it, as in Joshua Middleton, you know, it's very old. People have been wiping their hands over it for a long time. The same with Thomas Odell below. But you can get an idea here of the sheer volume of graffiti in this area. And in the north nave, there is quite a lot of names with lines written, squashed through them. And this may well depict someone who's died. This is what makes us think that it isn't about, I was here. This is about bringing people into the cathedral. So John Bassett may well not have done it himself. Again, another snapshot in the north nave. We've got another one of our little 2D houses or tents, but the one on the right from 1762 gives you an idea of the sheer scale of some of the graffiti, the size of it, the complexity of it, and the fact that they were able to do it without any censure, without anybody stopping them, because a lot of these are actually complete. So in our database that we're creating, we're also, I'm also looking at whether we can identify any themes. And one of the things that I'm noting is the 3x3. We have quite a large number of these scattered across the cathedral, some vertical on benches, most on the walls. And I think it could well represent the Trinity, which is 3, a significant number, and therefore 3x3 is more significant. But these occur so often outside of any name that they must be significant. So we're mapping those to find out where they're distributed across the building. In the same way, on the right-hand side, we've got an I, which is actually a J. They're interchangeable in Latin, especially with the little mark across the middle. JC. Is this a representation of, say, John Cole, or is this about Jesus Christ? So we're looking at how many we have. We do seem to have quite a number of these, and we shall also map them to see whether they can actually be in clusters. It may well be there were a lot of John Coles in Winchester in the 17th and 18th century. It may well be that this is some kind of religious idea. And in the same way, we would do the same with the number we have of these double W's. or double V's, it may well be a representation of the idea of Virgo Virgatum, the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Queen of Heaven. And on the right-hand picture, you can see there is the W is quite clear, and that you've got a 3x3 above it as well. But you've got these very distinctive, there could be a WA, but there's a number of them, and we're going to map them to see whether or not they are actually a continuation of the cult of the Virgin Mary, whether they appear inordinately across the cathedral, whether there's more of them than could be accounted for by someone, William Allen's in Winchester. And so what we have is a lot of work to carry on, because they can be really, really significant. Just to finish up in the South Nave aisle, you can see here just how deep some of the graffiti is. And we've got a beautiful helmed person on our left, somebody getting very creative with a helm and plume. Now, Winchester Cathedral is famous for its group of 6-cage chantries, and so we have looked at the graffiti in these. Some of the chapels have had quite a lot of work done, but we started looking at Eddington. Now, Eddington's effigy, which is made of alabaster and therefore very soft, has never had a makeover in the same way as the other effigies in these chapels. And it's here we see a number of daisy wheels that have been etched on this very, very soft alabaster. And the cathedral, when I've talked to different people around it, believe that the scholars of the next door Winchester College had quite a lot of time in the cathedral in the past, and it may well be their work. But this is the only untouched effigy we have of alabaster, and there is a significant amount of graffiti across this one. It's actually not as bad. The worst alabaster one I've ever seen is Abbot Seabrook in Gloucester Cathedral now, and he's got graffiti all over his face. He looks really like he's been tattooed. Wainfleet Chantry, again, this is there is graffiti on the stone, but what we have on the original 1470s door is this depiction of what could be a gallows. And this actually occurs in stone as well, elsewhere in the cathedral with the same name. So it may well be, it could be a door, it may well be commemorating someone who was hung, we might never know. The Gardiner Chantry Chapel is the first Renaissance style one, and therefore has these flat cartouches, as opposed to, you can see in the background, Wainfleet's chantries. And the Gardiner Chantry Chapel is smothered in graffiti. Some of it very old, 1582 ER, may well be a point to Stephen Gardiner that Elizabeth was still on the throne in 1582. But what we also have is a continuing number of graffiti on this chapel and across the cathedral generally. And it does throw up about the ethics of graffiti today. Now, I'm a historian saying this is really exciting. You've got 1582, and should we stop graffiti completely, or do we accept it goes on? Because the historians in 100 years' time might be more interested than I am in the modern stuff. So this sort of thing, we've got a 1608 Adrian Batten, and then we've got the more modern, and it's very often just scratches. So we have a comparison here. Richard Smith's is old, you can tell it's deep, the style of the writing, it's been taught, the hands have gone across it for probably centuries. And then on the right we have graffiti from 2011, in which they just scratch the colour off the front of the stone. Now, should this go on? Because will a historian in 100 years' time find this absolutely as fascinating as I find stuff that's old? It's a dilemma that probably has no answer, but is something that needs to be considered. Now, we've also gone into the less public areas, and this is the West Tower staircase. And this tower staircase takes you up into the roof void above the nave, to the bell ringer's chamber, the bell chamber, and the roof. And so we've actually looked at the graffiti along here. And as you can see, we got a nice depiction of in pencil, these are pencil ones, of a monkey, the larger gentleman from Laurel and Hardy, I think. And again, this is from 1942. The one on the right is a mason's mark. We can see those all the way through the tower. And what we have in this area is a large amount of Second World War graffiti, often in pen or pencil, going up the stairs. And the research needs to be done, but we think these are the fire watchers from the Second World War. We also have a post-World War II Vespa scooter, complete with flag, which I think is rather fun, again in pencil. But we have graffiti as well from the 18th century in this area. At the top of this stairs, as you enter the space above the nave, there is the high west window. And I think on the right-hand side, the ladders may well depict these fire watchers. But on the left, we have a depiction of a gravestone of someone who dies in 1889. So this really shows you how people bring in their friends or family into the cathedral for commemoration in a way that otherwise wouldn't have been done, because J. Packer had not done this himself. Somebody else has done it for him or her. Can I say at this point that the vast majority of identifiable graffiti is male? The only area that I found any collections of identifiably female graffiti is high in the south transept, and it's all from the 1960s. Everything else that can be identified is male. So I'm afraid I tend to refer to this as male. So J. Packer, someone has commemorated them with a gravestone in this probably inaccessible area for most people of the cathedral, complete with skull and crossbones. Absolutely beautiful. And then we go into the bell ringer's chamber. Now this created in the 18th century, I think it is, and the bell ringers have personalised it through graffiti. They have taken out and carved, as you can see here, the corners of the stones that hold up the rafters. They have decorated more or less every area, both stone and wood, with their commemorations. We have a crucifixion here that's been carved out of stone. They have taken this building and made it their own. They have official boards and have the unofficial graffiti as well. And going up a floor into the actual chamber where the bells are, the wood supporting the bell, supporting the roof, has graffiti from all periods in it. And the stone around it, oh, my apologies, got a picture there. There is a little gentleman there with a ruff, which is a very bad photograph. Not sure why my cathedral's turned up there. We do have it in stone as well. Going up a floor onto the roof is lead. There is virtually no graffiti on the lead at all, except the entrance to the roof. There is a list of names, and they're all dated from the 1940s, and I think these are the fire watchers. Again, this is an area we can do some research in the future, but they put themselves there. So historical graffiti. You can use it to look at the change in the cathedral. It was an enclosed monastic community till 1540, and it's only after then that we can see people getting in, perhaps more readily. We can see that and this is something that we'll bring out through the database, the idea that in this period of relative neglect, people had the opportunity to graffiti, but it still goes on. And in terms of access in the 20th century, in the 1920s, it was very difficult to access most cathedrals. And there is a south nave porch, which has a large number of 1920s pencil graffitis, complete families in some cases. And I think these are people who actually managed to get in and thought, I'm going to let everybody know I got in. So it's quite fun. But it can actually throw up other thoughts about the cathedral and how the cathedral was used and viewed. And this is a case in point. Now, these two little pieces of graffiti are either side of a pillar in the south nave aisle. Now, most people looking at them first off go, oh, they're eyes. But I ask you to consider the period of the Civil War, when the cathedral was sacked at least 3 times by the parliamentarians, if you were a royalist and rather annoyed about this, and you wanted to denigrate your enemies, what better than a bare-chested Puritan woman? And this is, you know, my personal interpretation of this graffiti, in that this is another insult in stone, a rude and lewd depiction of a Puritan woman. Perhaps gave the person who did it some satisfaction, I don't know. But this is the thing with graffiti, we'll never know, and therefore we need to bring in all the contextual evidence we can get to come up with a reasonable hypothesis. And then there is this beautiful piece of graffiti, again in the South Nave porch, created by George Porter, an ambulance driver in the First World War, and he creates this in January 1915. And my students and I looked him up, and in the 1911 census he was riding a pit pony in the pits, and then became an ambulance driver. He survived the war, was married in 1932 and died in the 1960s. Beautiful time capsule, and one of the things we'd like to do is try and find if he's got any family so they can know that he did this. And in the year since I found this, we have this modern, scratchy, and I have to say I'm not a fan of it, graffiti over the top of this, what I think is a beautiful time capsule. Now that is my opinion now. It might be that in 100 years' time that there is a historian who's far more interested in a kilo chaos than I am. So should this piece of unofficial graffiti be preserved in some way and protected, or should it just reflect the changing nature of the cathedral and the people who attend it? There is no answer to that, but it's certainly something we can discuss. So it's in a very small, dark place, private. People actually shouldn't be in there now. So I don't know how Mr. Aquilo and Mrs. Chaos managed to get in, but they did, and they have actually scratched over something that I think is quite valuable, but that's a subjective opinion. So where are we? There's dear old Harry. And what does Harry represent? Well, he represents context. This is 5 years after the end of the monastic community. This is therefore a 5-year period. After 5 years, he has the ability to do this, and the freedom and the space and the time to do this. Whether he has the authority, probably not, but nobody has actually replaced it. He had the opportunity. Why? Because the cathedral had changed in its nature. The authority within the cathedral had changed. He represents that. The location is significant. We can't look at that piece of graffiti without knowing its location and why that location was significant. And it tells us about the change in the use of the bell chamber, where the bell ropes came in. And if you look actually above that, you can see the hole in the ceiling where the bell ropes used to come through. It tells us in 1545, which is actually the year that Henry VIII dies in December, and the accession of his son Edward VI, that they're still ringing bells in the cathedral. You might not think that. And so what Harry represents really is that graffiti can be massively interesting. It's pretty, some of it, but if you can get so much more about it if you look at it in terms of its context, its location, its appearance, what happened to the building, that you can see the graffiti reflects. And it's about a group of people who are represented in a cathedral, in a building that they felt was significant to them, who are otherwise unnoticed. They're people who do not have the ability to have any other kind of commemoration other than this unofficial one. And it shows us that the cathedral at Winchester was not just significant for the elite people around it who had right of burial there, and monuments and tombs and chapels. It actually had an importance to the community, and they brought themselves in to this building, and we need to see the graffiti in that way. So, and that applies to every church. You know, they are part of the past, and they are the voice of people who can only tell us about themselves and their relationship with the church through graffiti. So thank you very much. Hopefully that was helpful.
Cindy, thank you so much. The comments coming in have been absolutely brilliant. So thank you so much for that. I'm just going to, there we go, subsequent. So we're about to go into question time, Cindy, but I just thought the way you ended that really resonates really well with our ethos at the Church's Conservation Trust, because one of the pillars of our strategy is that we're empowering local communities across the country to use and to love their historic places of worship. You know, our churches aren't used for regular worship anymore, but as you've shown there in your presentation, these churches really, or certainly Winchester Cathedral has been used by so many different people, not necessarily just for worship, but it's really got this community identity and the sense of people wanting to have ownership of that space, not necessarily for its original intentional purpose, but how people want to continue that story. So I think that's a really great way to finish that. We've had lots of questions already, but if you've got any more, everyone, please do comment away and we'll put them to Cindy. So I'm going to dive straight in. So our first question, is accusatory graffiti common in church? Is it common in the church environment? Your opening comments suggest that maybe it was mainly commemorative, the graffiti we find.
The William Eames insult is actually one of, I don't know of many others at all. And I think, Winchester Cathedral has always had its own community, and this is where research needs to tell us who William Eames was and who he upset. Most, I would say, is actually commemorative rather than accusatory. I think what the William Eames insult, which is absolutely wonderful, I think he's actually quite unusual. Yes.
Thanks, Cindy. And are there any written records, or does anything survive that indicates that cathedral authorities or church authorities were trying to dissuade people from graffitiing the fabric of the buildings?
No, and that's why we are doing this survey, really, because we got asked, suggested it was being done, because by handing over the photographs of the cathedral and the database, which we're starting to do, the cathedral have a snapshot of what they've actually got now, because they have no idea what they've got. There's no written records about it, no. No, and this is what makes it so fascinating. Everybody knows it's been going on. It's been going on everywhere. And I go to a medieval barn that was owned by the National Trust last year in Oxfordshire. There's the graffiti. It's something that's common, and I think it's so common that people just, it goes on. They might not like it, but there's no record about people's official reaction to it. So,
yeah. And there's an awful lot of graffiti at the cathedral. Is that quite common to see that much graffiti of a building that age, or is Winchester just got quite a lot in particular?
Well, it's interesting because I've been into the Salisbury Cathedral, have done the same thing. They've done a survey of all they've got quite a lot. I think Winchester has got an inordinate amount. I was in York Minster last year and I was looking for the graffiti in the nave. Virtually none. Why? I don't know. It didn't change character, York. York was always a secular cathedral. And I was hunting for it in York and could hardly find any. Whereas in Winchester, once you see it, this is my poor students, they say, well, I can't now not see a church and I can't not see graffiti. Winchester has an inordinate amount. But it's something that, I'm just about to talk to Exeter. Exeter have done some work on their graffiti, and it's something that is a very new area of historical evidence, and we're all starting to kind of link together, and it can only get more exciting, I think.
And I suppose we've had another question that kind of links to that. When you showed some of your slides there, some of them were incredibly intricate, and some of them were really deeply grooved into the stone. Does that suggest, you know, on certainly more complicated works of graffiti, or the ones that are a bit more ingrained, that people may have, you know, visited the cathedral several times to, you know, complete that part of graffiti? Or do you think it was done in one single sort of act?
I think that some of them had to have been done over several visits, because there is a P in the North Nave aisle that's about 10 centimeters high and must be about a centimeter deep. It's incredibly, you know, and they must have done it with a chisel and a hammer, because no only other way of doing it. And this is why I think it's the community going in. These are people who actually had access to the cathedral after it was no longer monastic, and they could go in and carry on. But again, you know, unfortunately in the past, very few people left us diaries to tell us why they did it or how they did it, which is why, you know, I encourage my students and I encourage everybody to keep a diary about what they did in the lockdown, because historians in the future will love you. Because we don't have the, you know, the diaries now of somebody who says, oh, I went into the cathedral to graffiti my father's name and it took me 3 weeks. We don't know, but some of them have got to have taken a while. Yeah.
And I suppose, and another question that's come in, sort of that links into that, is that it must, you know, if you're using hammer and chisel, it must be incredibly noisy. How would they have got away with that, do you think?
A brilliant point, absolutely brilliant. And that is the nub of the matter for some of it. And this is why you can actually look at this period in which these cathedrals had this relative neglect. And the stories for Winchester are that the elaborate canopy over Wainfleet's Chantry that I showed you, that was in such a bad state, there were about 4 wheelbarrows in it full of bits of that canopy. So you have this period of relative neglect, and I think you can actually add into that the graffiti to say, yes, it was neglected because somebody was able to stand there with a chisel and no one stopped them. That's not to say it's not the staff of the cathedral doing it themselves. You know, there is that, the other side of that is, this is the verger doing it on the quiet, but there's so much of it that some of it is so complicated. The authority to stop them wasn't there. I think that's the way to look at it. And this is what makes the graffiti so significant. If you understand the building sequence and the history of the building, this is another area of evidence that can reflect that.
Thanks, Cindy, and thanks for that question. I think that was really good point that came in.
Brilliant question.
We talked earlier about sort of William Eames. And someone's asked a question here, sort of, how is the surname actually spelt? As there appear to be 2 spellings of the organist's name, E-M-E-S and E-A-M-E-S. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It tells us that the period in which this occurs is a period in which there's no standardization of language or names. Any historian from before, certainly the 1800, names, there's no standardization in either spelling of names or even within language generally. So William Eames, yes, you would now put an A in it. But obviously the person there thought, I'll go for the shortened version because I'm there busy telling everybody he's a terrible man. But yes, yeah.
I think this is quite an interesting question. Are there any memento mori graffiti sort of examples in Winchester? I know they're quite rare elsewhere, this question said.
No, there's none. No, none at all. And not even in the Chantry chapels of Richard Fox, which I didn't show, or Stephen Gardner, which have got the cadavers in them. There's no memento mori that we've found at all. It's remarkable how many of them are just names and initials. We have very few pictorial depictions in the graffiti, relatively speaking, yes.
And someone's commented here saying their father was billeted in Winchester in Peninsular Barracks during World War II. Could some of the graffiti from that period be from soldiers billeted in the city?
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is the exciting thing for the future, is that I can give a student a bank of names and say, find out who they were, because if we, like the firefighters, I mean, there is the Hampshire Field Club. They've got a graffiti group, and they've done some work in a house in Southampton, and they went into the loft, and there's this there's a pipe and a window, and all around that is enormous amounts of graffiti, and they're all American soldiers just going off on D-Day, and so they can actually link them. And so to get that connection is really exciting, and that's something for the future, certainly. If you want to pass me his name, I'll see if I can find him.
Yeah, no, please do comment your everyone watching, if you want to get involved with the research, do let us know, because yeah, Cindy's got some great students
Yes,
with the project at that moment. Cindy, when we did a run through, so everyone, we did a run through earlier, and I spotted a tomb with a really interesting carving, that what I thought what it was, and someone's picked up on it, about the carving, which resembles a swastika, but it's actually not. Did you want to just explain a bit about what that is?
Yes, this is Bishop Eddington's effigy. Has quite a lot. He's got them around his collar and on his clothing. It's a back to front swastika. And this symbol actually is very, very old. The ancient Egyptians used it as well, and it's always been seen as a symbol of sunrise, new starts, fresh days, and therefore it's not surprising to find it on Eddington's Chantry. And what we find is that we have a modern version that have subverted it literally and figuratively, because the Third Reich have turned it round to make what we recognise as a swastika, and they've actually taken a very ancient symbol and adapted it, but it actually had connotations about rebirth and new days, and that might be why they used it. Fred, I'm not sure up on the symbolism of the Third Reich, but yes, that back to front swastika is really significant. Yeah.
Thanks, Cindy. And again, that's a well spotted, that, because I'll be yeah, that caught me out. So, no, thanks for explaining that, Cindy. How long do you think it might have taken to do some of these graffiti works of graffiti?
Well, the people who do them today take about 2 minutes, because they're really, really, I'm afraid when we catalogue them in our database, we call them light, and more or less they're scratches. Some of the older ones, I mean, that Joshua Middleton one that I showed you from, I think, 1760s, must have taken hours, because not only have they done quite a large piece of the full name and the date, and it's in a box. It's actually done in handwriting rather than the joining of the dots. So some of these took hours, and this is why I think the idea of people coming back for successive visits to do it, which then also suggests they're actually part of the community as well. They're not visitors from far away, but they're local, because they can keep coming in and adding to it. But some of them must have taken hours, absolutely hours. And the whole point is they had the hours in which to do it, and no one stopped them. No, and that's something you've got to hold on to. Graffiti is the opportunity that they had to do it.
And I think, that ties into really nicely to this question that's come in from someone who's their graffiti research volunteer at Canterbury Cathedral. And they asked, can they ask you why you feel that folk only graffitied walls illicitly? Where at Canterbury Cathedral, they have examples both medieval and post-Reformation in very visible locations. Mm-hmm. The nature of some of the marks, e.g. in Greek, suggests that they were learned people, and the location, for example, behind the Lady Chapel, suggests graffiti was also drawn by monks there.
How exciting. We haven't got anything that I can identify as by the monks in Winchester, which is such a shame. And we can't identify anything from the pilgrims either to St Swithin Shrine. Well, there must be some complicity within the cathedral community, or whether it was monastic or other, that allowed some people to do it. But whether or not you're learned or whether or not you're barely literate, the point is that the graffiti is the only way you can be commemorated in these buildings, because you're obviously not of sufficient status to be buried there. And so, and burial in these buildings is very, very limited, partly because of space and partly because of elitism as centuries go on. And Canterbury, burial is even by the 15th century really, really tricky. What you have is these people, vastly learned, but still not sufficient status to have burial there. So what you do is you graffiti your commemoration. You bring yourself into the building by graffiti. So absolutely, yes. how wonderful to find something that they think is from monks. Oh, I'm so envious.
But, and I've only got time now, I think, for one more question. I think this is a really nice one to finish on, but how can people is there a way people can get involved in your research, or how can they hear more about the work that you're doing at Winchester?
Well, you can email me at the Winchester. I'm on the website for the cathedral. And there is an opportunity. We're doing the boring things now, which is analysing all the photographs and adding to the database, which is vitally important. If anybody wants to help with that, they're very welcome. We haven't been able to do any photography this year because the cathedral has obviously been shut, and there are certain areas we need to do. So I'd, email me if you want to get involved. I'm more than happy to form a group and pass you out some photographs for analysis and see what you think. You become very, very quickly able to identify old and new graffiti very, very quickly. So yes, please do. Please email me. It'd be really nice if people want to get involved, and if you want to get in touch with me, because I can try and make connections with other cathedrals and other major churches that might want to do the same thing, and the network needs to grow. So, like the Canterbury person, please get in touch with me because I'd like to connect with them as well. It's such a new area of historical research. But there's so much potential if you look at it the right way, in that you look at it as a piece of evidence for people that otherwise have no other means of commemoration in these major buildings, or even a parish church.
Thank you so much, Cindy, and thank you everyone for your questions there. As Cindy said, if you want to get involved with the research, just either send us a direct message, and we'll ask you for your email address, and we'll collate everything, and we'll send Cindy an email. It'd also be great to hear from people who'd like to volunteer with CCT. I know there's quite a lot of people who like looking at our churches for graffiti, so if you're interested in looking at some of our churches for graffiti, do get in touch with us, and we'll see what we can sort out. Now, as I said at the start, Cindy's going to be joining us in October to do a talk on the physical manifestations of purgatory, which is another academic interest of Cindy, so do join us then. But next week we're going to be joined by Professor William White from the Oxford University, who's going to be talking to us about unlocking the church, the lost secrets of Victorian sacred space. So do join us next week at 1 p.m. for that lunchtime lecture. Now, as I said at the start of the lecture, if you've enjoyed this, please do consider making a donation towards our important work of caring for historic churches across the country. As you know, Cindy's shown in the lecture there, these places of historic importance are very much owned by communities, not just by churches or the religious. They are community assets and they belong to the community, and that's something that we at the CCT are very, very keen to make sure that these buildings belong to the community and are lasting for many, many years to come. So do text CCT to 70331 to give a gift of £3. Do visit our website, visitchurch.org.uk, or do consider taking our special membership offer up. There's a link in the description to this video. But if you've got any questions, do send us a direct message, and we'll do our best to get back to you. But also do comment away. We'll keep an eye on them. So if you've got any other questions, do let us know, and we'll send them to Cindy. But also do let us know if you've got any ideas for lectures. We really value your feedback. But thanks again to Cindy for joining us, and thank you everyone for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next week.